Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. As we've been working through the lead-up to the Pequot War, we've looked at several aspects, not the least of which were the obnoxious treaties the Dutch and English expected the Pequots to honor over the course of several years. In that same time, they had endured a devastating plague that had greatly diminished their numbers, and the death of their main sachem, Tadobem. Sassacus, the new main sachem, faced many challenges both internally and externally. We've not talked about the internal challenges yet, but we're nearing the end of the external challenges. In this episode, we'll pick up right after the successful diplomatic campaign of Roger Williams in late 1636, when he visited the two primary Narragansett sachems, Canonicus and Myantonomy. In short, what we learned last time, as Williams himself recorded, was, quote, "The Lord helped me immediately to put my life into my hand, and scarce acquainting my wife, to ship myself all alone in a poor canoe, and to cut through a stormy wind with great seas, every minute and hazard of life, to the sachem's house. 3 days and nights my business forced me to lodge and to mix with the bloody Pequot ambassadors, whose hands and arms, methought, reeked with the blood of my countrymen, murdered and massacred by them on Connecticut River, and from whom I could not but nightly look for their bloody knives at my own throat also." End quote. No doubt it was dangerous for him to make that trip. So dangerous, again, he didn't tell his wife what he was doing, and he went by himself. The travel was hazard, and it was even more hazardous amongst the natives. But while he was there, Roger Williams not only pled the case for Narragansett neutrality, at a minimum, but as part of the negotiations, had to work through several realities about his own people. He had to work through with Canonicus himself the concepts of plague and the fact that the English also suffered under the plagues. He had to acknowledge the fact that the English were not always very trustworthy, and their concept of war was far more brutal than the natives. Those are tough points for anyone to overcome under any circumstances, let alone those that had brought Roger Williams here in the first place. Nevertheless, Williams was a diplomatic success. As well as learning the tactical aspect of the Pequot plan, he secured Narragansett neutrality. That was a big win. The intended goal had been to keep the natives from uniting, and he did it. Not only had he secured, at a minimum, Narragansett neutrality and future unity, but also Mohegan, a group that will develop in just a little while. Well, in a few episodes. But for now, let's continue with our current portion of the narrative. If you'll remember, we ended last time with two questions. The first was, what did Roger Williams get for his success? And the second question was, how would the Narragansetts end up being not neutral, but actually allies with the English? What happened? So let's see what Roger Williams got for his trouble, and then let's see how it was that the Narragansetts came to fight on the side of the British. Back in Boston, it was well known that Roger Williams had succeeded where the magistrates would not have. Roger Williams had succeeded where John Endicott could not have. John Winthrop Sr. was so impressed that he tried to get Williams's lifetime banishment canceled. He didn't accomplish that. In fact, Puritan historian William Hubbard really played loose with the facts on this one and only recorded that the Narragansetts had begged Massachusetts Bay for an alliance. That's pretty sneaky. As Francis Jennings put it, quote, "thus achieving by one falsification both the demeaning of the Indians and the elimination of William's personal role as benefactor of the Bay," end quote. Again, this was right in the middle of a lot of social, religious, and political upheaval in the Bible state itself. It was not long after this that John Winthrop Sr. was again the top guy. He would be elevated on May 17th to the office of governor when he defeated the current Governor Vane after he backed Anne Hutchinson during the Antinomian controversy. And if you missed that, We did a series of episodes on both Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson a while ago. Those events are a great example of how this podcast is designed, presenting history not only in a chronological setting, but in layers, event by event. Placing these layers on top of each other not only gives a good overview of the specific drivers for specific events, but also the larger picture. I mean, there's always more going on than the current singular narrative. And that stands to reason, because that's the way it is in our own lives. We're always juggling multiple events. It just seems to have been a lot uglier in Massachusetts Bay than I remember learning about in school or seeing in movies or even educational materials, no matter what the medium happens to be. I've said before that I like old country music. When I was younger, I always thought it was because of the nostalgic pictures that they drew with words. As I got older, I realized the draw for me was not the nostalgic pictures they drew, but rather the illusion of the nostalgia. You know, those old songs about valor and honor, love stretched to the breaking point that holds for decades and inspires a new generation within a family to devotion. Often that nostalgia seems only to be make-believe. I mean, be honest. If you're like me and enjoy that style of music, you know it too. The pictures they paint are often fictional. In the real world, the pictures they paint don't always end well. I mean, that genre is really like a musical version of Norman Rockwell wearing cowboy hats and boots. Or how about Paul Simon's Kodachrome? That's a great old song. I still love it. It's got a catchy beat, but it's also got a more realistic view of the world, a more sobering approach to how we can perceive what never was, how we can move through life without quite as clear a view as we think we have. I mean, and frankly, ignorance isn't bliss. It's ignorance. It's misinformation. It's hard to work with when real trouble comes. You remember Kodachrome, don't you? I mean, listen to these lyrics. Tell me if they don't resonate more and more as you grow older. Now, I'm not going to sing the song. I'm assuming that you've heard it anyways, but I will read the lyrics. You don't want me to sing. I'll sing just this first line or two, and then it'll probably bring the song back to your memory if you've forgotten it. It goes like this. It's a catchy little tune. When I think back on all the crap I learned in high school, it's a wonder I can thank it all. Okay, so that's my really crappy a cappella rendition of just that opening line. But I'm sure that you've heard the song. Hopefully that jarred your memory if you had forgotten it. I want to read these lyrics, though. When I think back on all the crap I learned in high school, it's a wonder I can think it all. And though my lack of education hasn't hurt me none, I can read the writing on the wall. Kodachrome. They gave us those nice bright colors. They give us the greens of summers. Makes you think all the world's a sunny day. Oh yeah, I got a Nikon camera. I love to take a photograph. So mama, don't take my Kodachrome away. If you look at all the girls I knew when I was single and brought them all together for one night, I know they'd never match my sweet imagination. Everything looks worse in black and white. Sometimes Paul Simon says everything looks better in black and white. But at any rate, it goes back into the chorus, Kodachrome. They give us those nice bright colors. They give us the greens of summer. Makes you think all the world's a sunny day. Oh yeah, I got a Nikon camera. I love to take a photograph. So mama, don't take my Kodachrome away. Now that we've read through the lyrics, tell me if they don't resonate more and more as you grow older. It's a catchy tune. I mean, they're fun lyrics to partially remember and sing once in a while. But actually, they're very astute. It's a very keen observation on how we often move through our lives. I mean, it does seem like a lot of things that we learn from an educational standpoint, an organized, standardized educational system, it really is a bunch of crap. It is surprising that we can think it all. I mean, look around society today. Frankly, a lot of people can't think. And then the idea of the Kodachrome, taking a crystal clear picture that you can immortalize and keep forever, and you can look back on something long in the distance, and it all just looks so good, right? And I always love that next stanza. If you took all the girls I knew when I was single and brought them all together for one night, I know they'd never match my sweet imagination. Everything looks worse in black and white. But the Kodachrome gives you the color, right? The memory, you remember things not as they actually were, but you remember things the way you want them to be. But our view and opinions of history can be just as much a mirage as our own nostalgic memories. Catchy names and places, often nothing more than answers to trivia questions. Paper lions of knowledge. They look so good, but they offer nothing of substance to really learn from, to apply to our own lives and times and experiences. Mama, don't take my Kodachrome away. Let me have my nostalgia. Don't bother me with the facts. That's how I approach these time frames, recognizing that the good old days may not have always been so good. The narratives or feelings that we have of certain time frames may not stand up to scrutiny. They may challenge our own narrative or convictions. Anyone want to be a black man in the Deep South in the 1950s in the United States of America? Sorry for you folks living in the Deep South, but I don't think I'd want to be that guy. About the same time as Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best were on air, you've got these guys living in the Deep South, going through very different circumstances and having a very different outlook on life and having very different opportunities presented to them. Those were great shows, Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best. Very nostalgic. They present a life and a time most would admire, most would like to experience. They're hard to mirror in real life. I enjoy them for the escape that they allow from everyday life. I'm not trying to be a downer here or a revisionist. I'm not down on my country or my society or my culture and how it grew up. Rather, I'm trying to set the stage to get the proper context. Getting the brain to focus on the actual events and using them to paint my picture. One way I try to keep myself honest, or at least my personal biases in check, is just using everyday common examples of the messaging that we absorb without considering the actual message. And again, Paul Simon summed that up so well in Kodachrome. The crap they taught us in school, organized education, it's amazing that we can think it all. The fact is, we look back on those time frames, even the young loves of our lives, we have these nostalgic views of them. But the reality is, if you went back to those times, you'd realize some of these things weren't quite as grand as we thought they were. I love my country. I love learning about it. I love history in general. But I want to understand how it really was from as many angles as possible, not just to know, but to learn, to apply. I want to know what the truth is. I love my country, but I don't love my country enough to bend the truth, right? So anyways, that's enough of the soapbox. As we go through some of these next several episodes, it gets pretty dark sometimes. As you can probably tell, I'm not a huge fan of the organization of the Puritan Society in New England. I think they accomplished a lot of great things. I really admire them in a lot of ways. I've read a lot of Puritan literature, but some of these outliers and some of these things that they did and the way the society was maintained, there's not a lot of people listening to my voice today that would have done well living back then. And there's not a lot of people listening to my voice today, even those of you that admire the Puritan society and culture, and I've got friends that do. But I can tell you right now, most of you wouldn't fare very well. Not only would you not like it, they wouldn't be very tolerant of you. So we need to keep that in perspective. And this is what we're driving at here, is that the Puritans in Boston, the magistrates and the leaders and those guys that were recording these events, they've recorded these events in a very slanted way. And it's not like today with social media and 15 different news channels, and you get the 24-hour news cycle and spin. And yes, everybody can go find the news cycle or the news guy or, the commentator that tells them what they want to hear. But the reality is we do have a lot of options and choices. And there is a way to sift through all of the noise and actually get to the bottom of quite a bit of the things that we experience in the world that we live in today. Not so back then. You didn't have as many guys recording, the history that was being made, the actual events. And it definitely went to the guy that won, right? So the guy writing the event is framing the argument. So again, enough of the soapbox, sorry. So Roger Williams was not going to get his due reward for his most important contribution to the cause of Massachusetts Bay. He was out of Puritan society. So much of his contribution was out as well. The magistrates were the real power brokers. And as we have said before, those who win are usually the very people allowed to frame the arguments, to set the narrative. And their version becomes the official version. Their version becomes the norm. You remember we've talked about the missing or the partial records of several key events in just the last few months of this portion of our narrative right here in New England, by the guys who represented the foundational generation of literally centuries of regional dominance that came out of Boston. That's a big statement I just made. Let that sink in. That's how the world is. Massachusetts Bay wanted control of the wampum and the furs. They were making decisions that were causing them to be estranged even from their own countrymen in neighboring colonies and settlements. And those guys were Puritans. As we'll see in just a few years, not a few years of our narrative, although it'll be a few months, they gave even less consideration to the non-Puritan colonies. So at any rate, Roger Williams, he's successful. He's pretty much written out of the narrative as far as the Puritans are concerned. But the negotiations themselves had gone so well in Massachusetts' eyes that they offered a formal official invite to the Narragansetts to come to Boston. They knew there were still some deep-rooted hostility within the rank and file toward the English, not just in a general sense like the issues that Roger Williams had worked through, but others as well, more directly related to their lives. I mean, Plymouth was still very close with Massasoit and the Wampanoags, and that was a sore subject, and it always would be. Now, again, I know we've worked through this before, but remember, most of the native leadership for all of these different tribes was more of a group of leaders sharing much of the load. The main sachem would rise more because of an advanced ability to garner consensus among the others. They were more adept at the art of persuasion. They were not generally like dictators. Like they didn't just get everything they wanted. They did not generally act unilaterally. Their opinions did hold a lot of sway from a reputation of wisdom and sound judgment. And that's not to say just anyone was capable of being the main sachem because they were smart. It was a position that was often passed from generation to generation, or at least within the royal bloodline. That was also why there was often a lot of intermarriage between native groups. Leaders and leadership consolidated power and influence through these marriages. So at this time, the Narragansetts were led by a co-sachemship, basically. Canonicus represented the old guard, the aging generation, while his nephew, or some narratives have said son, Maiantonomo, or Maiantonomi, depending on the book I'm reading, represented the younger up-and-coming generation. And by 1636, Canonicus, still the main guy, really, had handed over a lot of his responsibilities to Maiantonomo. As much as Canonicus had had reservations about the Roger Williams visit, Maiantonomo had been more accommodating and encouraging. He and Williams actually struck up quite a friendship with each other. It was he who had really wanted to protect the relations with the English. I mean, he must have realized that eventually, more than likely, he was going to be the guy after Canonicus passed from the scene. And he also understood what the future held in terms of English colonialism. At this time, at least, he seems like a pragmatist. But that pragmatism would change. But it would be a few years down the road until it did. So before we go too much farther with the Massachusetts Bay storyline, which is our real focus here, I think it's important to realize that in addition to the Pequot envoys and Roger Williams, there were other groups, native groups, represented that were also petitioning the Narragansetts against the Pequots. Now, one of those natives was Cutshamakin of the Massachusetts tribe. I hope I'm saying his name correctly. It's spelled a couple of different ways depending on the books I read. I'm doing the best I can to sound these out, but I believe his name was Cutshamakin. We met him before. He was one of the native guides that had helped John Endicott on his mission. Actually, he was the one guy that definitely did record a kill. If you remember, he had not only killed a Pequot, but he had set upon him and scalped him before the English could stop him. I mean, that's more than just an interesting side note here, because he ended up giving that scalp to Canonicus, and Canonicus was delighted to have received it. So this is a guy from the Massachusetts tribe also trying to encourage the Narragansetts to war against the Pequots. I mean, Just receiving that scalp, knowing that Canonicus was that pleased, that must have lightened his mood a little bit towards Roger Williams. There were also other Pequots on site, believe it or not. They were not a part of the official Pequot delegation. In fact, they were in opposition to it. These two guys, their names were Wequash and a guy whose name I believe is Watlak Quack-Omin. It's quite a name. Watlak Quack-Omin. There's 20 letters in there. So these guys were actually rivals to Saussicus, the main Pequot sachem, and were actively seeking the Narragansett support against Saussicus. Now, Wequash seems to have had a legitimate claim to the sachemship. I think both of these guys were claiming sachemship, but Wequash seems to have had what would be a reasonable claim, at least, to be the main sachem. We'll talk more about him later. He's got a larger role to play down the road, so we'll definitely be visiting him again. But this also must have made Canonicus happy. So now you've not only got, a traditional enemy in the Pequots that are starting to get pushback from the English. You've got an English diplomat coming to try and convince you to be on his side. You've got the Massachusetts tribe trying to convince you, at least somebody from the Massachusetts tribe, trying to convince you to go against the Pequots. And also, even within their own camp, you're beginning to see this fracturing of their leadership because you've got guys that are recognized leaders in the Pequot camp that are actually here working against Saussicus. So Roger Williams had faced an uphill battle, when he met with Canonicus, because Canonicus was also listening to the Pequots and also had reservations about the English that were far removed from just Roger Williams' visit. But he did have some things going for him as well. These natives representing different native groups and different objectives helped to sway the Narragansetts away from Pequot support. And lastly, the Pequot nation had undergone a split recently over the sachemship. The real challenger to Saussicus was Uncas. I know we've mentioned him several times. Believe me, we're going to develop his story. He's extremely important, not just at this point in time in history, but moving forward for a couple of decades, he's going to actually play a very important role. But at this point, Uncas was leading just a small breakaway band known as the Mohicans. And again, he's going to play a significant role for several years after this time. Actually, he would prove to be the downfall of many, many people. But anyways, it was at this same time that Roger Williams had also secured the Mohegan support as well. So I kind of feel sorry for the Pequots about now. Let's face it, there were no guys in this fight that were pure as the driven snow. They all had one objective at this point, and that was to take out the number one guy. That was the Pequot nation. That was Saussicus. Whether for wealth, like with the English, for power, like the other native tribes, or for security, which everybody wanted. Everybody had an axe to grind, and everybody was here together. Just how big was this Narragansett village? How could they have possibly supported all of these different diplomatic groups chirping at the same time? It's a wonder that fights didn't break out. Maybe they did. Maybe they just weren't recorded. I don't know. But you've got a multiple of factions here coming together in this one village at this specific time. I would say that some of the Pequots had left the Pequot nation and were now living among the Narragansetts. So maybe that helped to soften some of these visits. I don't know. But it was later in the fall that the Massachusetts Bay leadership extended an invitation to the Narragansetts to come to Boston for a meeting. They were still nervous. They needed to know what was going on. They needed to talk to the sachems face to face. Diplomacy can be a lot like sales. And I can attest as a sales guy, there's a certain paranoia one feels all the way up until the contract is actually signed and the check is not cut, but in the bank. So Roger Williams had come back and he had said that the Narragansetts had pledged, at least, if nothing else, neutrality. But the Massachusetts Bay leadership, they had to know. They had to try and understand for themselves exactly what was going on. And frankly, I know I'm kind of hard on these guys, but you can't blame them at this point. So that's where they were at. There was an understanding that the Narragansetts would stand down. But what did that mean? They'd been encouraged by the success of Roger Williams, but now they needed to see that for themselves. They needed to test the waters, so to speak. So they sent an entourage to the Narragansetts for the formal invite to Boston. There was no Roger Williams this time. They were going to walk through the doors left open by Roger Williams, but they were going to keep him out of the limelight. And Edward Johnson, a part of that entourage, recorded that the Narragansetts had received the delegation well, that they had entertained them and fed them with great food. And Edward Johnson, keeping in lockstep with his buddy William Hubbard, made zero mention that the warm reception was due in large part to the work that Roger Williams had done. His credit would not come for at least a century. Anyway, they had a meeting in a big fancy building. Even by English standards, this was an impressive structure. And they were permitted to speak openly with Canonicus and his supporting cast of leaders. Johnson recalled how stately and wise the leaders were, to his surprise. Remember, the Puritans didn't think much of the natives, really. To his credit, he actually recorded, for posterity's sake, that they defied his opinion of who they were and how they acted. They were stately, they were sophisticated, they were hospitable, they weren't animals, they weren't ignoramuses, they weren't stupid or petty, they were civilized, they were thoughtful, they were reflective, they were polite. They gave real attention to what was being said to them. Mayantonomi was there, and it was his response who Johnson recorded. He displayed a depth of understanding and nuance to the game being played that, to me, underscored exactly why he was being groomed to assume the main sachem duties in the future. He listened to what the English had to say, and then he gave them his assessment of the situation. And there's a noticeable difference, I think, in tone or approach, because whereas the English seemed intent to secure the Narragansett support against the Pequots, Mayantonomi's response was more multifaceted. A lot like Canonicus's conversations with Roger Williams. Mayantonomi told the English that he wanted peace with them, but also with the Pequots. They were the more aggressive tribe, while traditionally the Narragansetts were more peaceful. They weren't looking for a fight with anybody. Furthermore, he pointed out that the English were greatly outnumbered by the Narragansetts at this point. At this point, there were thousands of Narragansetts, many, many, many times more than the Puritans. They had real numbers to put in the battlefield. He also recognized that the English had superior weapons and came from a land that outnumbered all the natives put together. And if their fellow countrymen came, or kept coming, they would have superior numbers and weapons. So, just like before, on Roger Williams' previous diplomatic visit, Mayantonomi only offered neutrality. But after the delegation left, Roger Williams continued to push for Narragansett military action. At this time, Mayantonomi may have already begun his regular visits to Roger Williams' house, where the two men would discuss many things. Ultimately, again, Roger Williams wore his counterpart down and succeeded in convincing Mayantonomi to go to Boston. It was October 1636. He arrived in Boston with two of Canonicus's sons, another sachem, and 20 men, no doubt a security detail. The last part of the trip, from Roxbury to Boston, the natives were escorted by 20 Englishmen that had come from Boston. And I do wonder how that went. Was that friendly as they all walked the last, multiple miles? Was it serious? Was this a serious escapade? Was it a planned rendezvous? Were the natives making their way to Boston and surprised, in Roxbury that these 20 guys came and said, "We'll take you to our leader"? I just wonder how that interchange went, how that exchange went. Did they speak the languages? Were they able to converse at all? I don't know. But it was Governor Vane, the soon-to-be deposed Governor Vane, actually, who made the invite. How often, I wonder, was he talking to Roger Williams at this point? Remember, this is when the Anne Hutchinson controversy was actually blowing up. This is when they were taking her to court and they were, ridiculing her and they were interrogating her. It wasn't long before she and her family were forced to flee the colony, just as Roger Williams had done. By the following summer, Governor Vane would be back in England because he had backed Anne Hutchinson. So I'm wondering if Vane and Williams, as they're talking back and forth about these things, were their conversations all about the business of Massachusetts Bay? I find that hard to believe since Williams wasn't even allowed to live there anymore. So I wonder, as the controversy with Anne Hutchinson's building up and Vane takes her side, was there counsel from Williams to Vane at this point, talking about his own experience? Was there some measure of encouragement? Was Vane, emboldened because of his friendship with Roger Williams? I mean, I don't know how that worked out, but if you haven't picked up on it yet, I think the whole antinomian controversy was frankly just bullshit. There were a lot of lives that were ruined, a lot of double dealing by some of the leading Puritans. Anyway, we covered that pretty well several episodes ago. We won't go back into that, but Vane was still here and he was the governor and he's basically running this little entourage, this escapade. And I'm just wondering how those conversations between he and Roger Williams actually went. It's kind of funny that Roger Williams, was so involved in the backdoor dealing here. So at any rate, the natives show up in Boston, and it's now the English leadership's turn to be hospitable. They put on a pretty good spread themselves. They were well represented by the magistrates and clergy, and my Antinomy and the other sachem dined with the Massachusetts Bay Council in the governor's quarters. The rest of the natives ate at a local inn. My Antinomy must have been pleased with how he was received, because after dinner he addressed the leaders, and he affirmed his love for the English and that his desire was peace. Just judging by that action alone, it must have gone really well. Like, he must have been pleased. I don't think he would have affirmed his love for the English and that his desire was peace if he hadn't been pleased with how they received him. But he continued. He said that the Narragansetts would continue to war with the Pequots. And that's kind of an odd statement to me, an odd promise, because frankly, they had been under kind of a quasi-truce since the 1634 treaty between the Pequots and the English. But anyways, at this point, that truce was over, and my Antinomy is saying that they will go back to war against the Pequots. That had been an ongoing thing. He pledged support for the English and their allies until the Pequots were beaten. He gave assurances that the Narragansetts would kill or deliver Pequots as they encountered them. These are big promises. As a face-saving gesture, I mean, there had to be something in it for the Narragansetts, right, to take away from this. He could go back and tell his people, look at what we got. So there must have been a lot of problems that I didn't see a lot of writing about, not a lot of recordings. If there were, I'm sure somebody recorded them. But he said that, quote, if any of theirs should kill our cattle, we would not kill them, but rather accept payment, end quote, reciprocity. What he was saying was, if the English colonials, the settlers, as they branch out from Boston, I mean, they must have been trampling on Narragansett property as well. I mean, if they're trampling on everybody else's property, why would they be left out, right? So it seems to me what he's saying is, look, if any of your guys kill our cattle, I mean, it must have been happening, we won't kill them, but we will accept payment. So now at least he could go back and tell his people, if they're being harassed by English settlers or if their cattle are coming up dead because of the English, now at least he can go back and tell them, look, we have a deal with that. You're going to be repaid for that. I don't know how that would actually work. I mean, I don't know. But anyways, he concluded all of these promises by telling them that at that very time, he was prepared to make a firm peace and would follow that up with a present in 2 months' time. I can almost feel and see the relief and the joy on the part of the English audience that night. This was more than they could have possibly hoped for. But diplomacy is a tricky thing. It's a skill. It's an art if done right. And I think Vane's response was masterful. Whether he intended it to be or not, maybe they just wanted to regroup and talk things over. But think about what's transpiring here. I mean, this guy shows up from one of the most powerful tribes in the region. He shows up. You've been trying to court his allegiance and his military prowess. You've never really been able to make a lot of headway. He shows up. He not only gives you what you've asked for, he bends over backwards to accommodate and give you more. And instead of just saying, oh my gosh, thank you so much, and having like some big love fest, it's like Governor Vane says, well, Here now. My Antinomy, these are very good offers that you've given to us. I think that we're going to have to think about this. And when we regroup in the morning, why, we'll give you our answer. That is very shrewd. I mean, at least that's how I interpret and perceive it from, 400 years removed. But that just seems to me to be the game that he was playing. So it was, again, Governor Vane told my Antinomy that they would resume their talks in the morning. And when they met the next day, the English presented Miantonomi with a formal treaty. It committed the Narragansetts to both a defensive and offensive alliance with the English. I mean, that is to say, the Narragansetts were expected to help the English. They would defend the English if they were attacked, but they would also take the fight to the Pequots alongside the English when the English were ready. That's a really nice setup for Boston. I mean, the Pequots would have little chance, if any, of ever attacking them directly. Ever. They would have had to go through the Narragansetts first. But here's what the English expected. No safe place for the Pequots. The Narragansetts were to put to death or deliver to the English any native who killed an Englishman. Any native, not just Pequot. The Narragansetts were to return runaway English servants hiding among the Narragansetts. So you've already got that problem brewing. Servants running away, indentured servitude. Maybe even slaves at this point, I'm not sure. They also pledged that they would give the Narragansetts notice when they were going on the offensive and required that they provide guides for those offensive operations. They also said that there would be free trade between the two peoples. And lastly, the agreement stated that there would be no peace with the Pequots unless both the English and the Narragansetts agreed. That was a very European treaty, not a very native type treaty. Miantonomi had trouble understanding it. I mean, oddly enough, his interpreter for this meeting was our old buddy Cutchomakin, the same Massachusetts native that keeps cropping up. Remember, he's the guy that was the guide for John Endicott. He's the guy that killed the Pequot. He's the guy that took the scalp. He's the guy that gave the scalp to Canonicus and made him very happy. And so here he is again as an interpreter for Miantonomi. I mean, he must have had a real axe to grind against the Pequots. You know, his was a tribe in and out of all of these different events as we've seen throughout our narrative, all the way back to the early days of Plymouth and Squanto. So anyways, Miantonomi did not understand exactly what the treaty meant, but he signed it with his mark, which ironically enough was an arrow. I mean, isn't that like on every cowboy and Indian movie that we saw as children? Their mark is an arrow. Anyways, the Massachusetts Bay delegation promised to send a copy to Roger Williams, who would explain it to them. And I'm guessing Cutchomakin probably struggled with the concept as well. I mean, he might have been able to be a verbal interpreter, but again, you're talking about very European terms on this treaty, very European-styled agreement. He just might not have been able to grasp exactly what was going on here. So at any rate, oddly enough, Miantonomi actually puts his mark on this document, not even really knowing what he's signing. But true to their word, Roger Williams did receive that copy and did explain it to both Miantonomi and Canonicus. And they both gave it their blessing, which is really weird. I mean, maybe Miantonomi, I think he was a pretty shrewd guy, and he's shown some real wisdom, throughout these different diplomatic, endeavors. But, he kept stressing the point that he wanted peace with the English. So I think he realized ultimately the English are going to be the biggest guys on the block. But Canonicus, I mean, this is an older guy. He's got, decades of pride and leadership under his belt, and frankly, not a lot of time left. It's amazing to me that he would look at that agreement and agree to the terms as they were, because it was extraordinarily lopsided. But like so many treaties that the Pequots had been forced or tricked into signing, they signed the treaty. Now, in the years to come, there would be friction between the English and the Narragansetts. But for now, all was well. The English had secured a major ally. They had secured the geography of Boston and Plymouth by virtue of the Narragansett Pledge. Now, on top of all of this, there were real native supporters of anyone warring with the Pequots, and they are worth developing. And there was still much to come. I mean, Connecticut was on fire. The Pequots had not been spending their time on diplomacy, and they would not spend their time on diplomacy throughout the coming winter. The might of the Pequot was going to be felt by Englishmen all throughout the Connecticut settlements. Those actions are worth looking at. But both the cast of native characters and the violence that erupted in the winter of 1636 going into 1637, our stories will continue next week. As for this week, I hope our time together has really helped the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.